1942. The German plan to invade Malta. Operation Hercules. It was supposed to be the culminating action of the 2-year siege of Malta, but the right moment never quite came, and the initiative was lost. A major British naval base just 93 kilometers or 57 miles from the Sicilian coast, Malta was always going to be a target in the event of a war with Italy. Surprisingly, given that its strategic significance had been acknowledged since ancient times, the island had very little in the way of fortification. The British had passed up the chance of improving its defences in the pre-war years, despairing of it as completely undefendable. An arid outcrop in mid-Mediterranean, Malta had no real prospect of being able to sustain itself with food. Most essential supplies, including oil, had to be shipped in. Making the island militarily impregnable would only postpone the inevitable, prolonging the agony for defenders who stood no real chance of getting through a determined siege. The decision had already been taken that when war broke out and the island came under attack, the British would cut their losses and let it go. Alexandria on the coast of Egypt would replace it as their main base. Islands under siege. So much for the power of foresight. In the event, when hostilities began, events followed a completely different course. The expected onslaught wasn't slow in coming. With the RAF engrossed in the Battle of Britain, few planes or pilots would be spared for Malta's air defences, so Mussolini's bombers were able to ply back and forth at will. Valletta, with its dockyards, suffered heavy damage. The island was buffeted by bombs for weeks on end. The good news for the Maltese was that, relentless as the bombing might have been, there was no attempt to follow through at ground level with an amphibious attack. Their island would have been very vulnerable in this case, but since Mussolini had chosen to commit the vast majority of his troops to the invasion of Greece, the strategy of aerial bombardment was maintained. Yet Malta could take this sort of punishment as long as its supplies held out, for if the island had few fortifications, it had natural air raid shelters in the form of caves, cushioned from shocks by the soft sandstone through which they ran. Casualties among islanders were accordingly low and spirits high, even if the longer-term outlook wasn't quite rosy. Whatever Italy's priorities, the strategy of the Germans was being decided by events on quite a different island. By November 1940, the Battle of Britain had run its course. The Luftwaffe had thrown just about everything it had at the Royal Air Force, the British people, and at UK industry and commerce. Britons had come through in what Winston Churchill called their finest hour. But the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,500 aircraft in what had been the first real check for their blitzkrieg tactics. The Germans had to retire to lick their wounds. Into Africa. Not, of course, that their efforts to quell British resistance were at an end, but it was clear that a new approach would be required. The focus now shifted to the south. Hitler's hopes of taking Gibraltar were part of a broader strategy of isolating the British from their empire. In this context, Malta took on a new importance, an imperial possession. It had a historic role as a way station on the route to Suez and the east. North Africa was significant in this scheme since whoever occupied its coast was in a position to control access to the Suez Canal. Running the gauntlet. Egypt itself had been an informal colony of Britain since the 19th century, but the rest of the Maghreb was now in Axis hands. The victim of a one-sided war of conquest by fascist Italy in 1934, Libya belonged to Italy. Other countries, including Tunisia, Algeria, and eastern Morocco, were under the control of Vichy France. Western Morocco was Spanish-ruled, and while Hitler may have had his difficulties with General Franco, he was certainly no friend of the Allied powers. British shipping in the Mediterranean already had to steer a careful course as it ran the gauntlet of forces from Axis-held southern Europe on the one hand and North Africa on the other. If the Axis held Malta, they would have the British in a stranglehold. For Britain, it suddenly seemed that Malta had to be held at all costs. For the Axis powers, the island was a prize that simply had to be seized. For both sides, it was as vital to deny Malta to the other as it was to have the facilities it offered for themselves. From the British perspective, the possession of the island made possible the passage of ships through the Mediterranean. It was also the platform from which attacks on Axis aircraft and shipping assisting in the build-up of forces in North Africa could be made. Italy's supreme commander, Ugo Cavaliero, was in no doubt about Malta's strategic importance. The assault on Malta will cost us many casualties, but I consider it absolutely essential for the future development of the war. If we take Malta, Libya will be safe. Straight from the fox's mouth. Destined to go down in history for the flair and imagination with which he fought, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel nonetheless had a quick enough eye for the more mundane. As early as 1941, the Desert Fox was warning that his swashbuckling attacks and his men's heroics were all going to be in vain if they couldn't receive the equipment and supplies they needed. Without Malta, he said frankly, the Axis will lose control of North Africa. A major undertaking. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had overall responsibility for Hercules, though General Major Kurt Student was to take charge of the airborne assault. As commander at the Battle of Crete, he'd had a tough grounding in this very specialized sort of operation. This time round, though, he had time to do some serious homework. Some 500 German Junkers, Ju-52 transport planes, plus some 200 transporters of the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, and 500 gliders of assorted size. Student and his staff worked out where every drop was to be made, where every aircraft was to come to land, and exactly what 29,000 airborne troops were required to do. The operation would have an amphibious component too, though this wasn't expected to arrive in Malta before the airborne troops had made it safe to land. Italian forces were to make the attack, which was to come in two waves. First, some 25,000 shock troops, including Marines and Commandos, with mobile artillery and light tanks. These would be followed up by more than 30,000 regular troops, bringing with them heavy artillery and tanks. In preparation, landing craft was specially built by the Italians, about 50 in all. The plan assumed that these would be supplemented by craft brought by the Germans. The moment passes. A big operation then, with huge numbers of men and vast amounts of material involved, considering the tiny island they were trying to take. And frantic resistance was pretty much guaranteed, so dramatically had Malta's military value soared since the North Africa campaign got underway in earnest. Ironically, its preparations were to be undercut by the demands of that campaign as it continued. Rommel, who had done so much to sell the cause of Operation Hercules to a skeptical Führer, was faring better than expected in his Libyan offensive, scenting victory. He was desperate to push on towards Alexandria and Suez. As time went on, and more men and resources were channeled into his campaign, it became clear to Kesselring that the chances of Hercules being successful carried through were receding fast. Hitler, who had never been fully behind the plan, now became unsympathetic, and in the spring of 1942, the plan was dropped.